Take a close look at the man smiling on your screen. To the algorithm, he appears to be just another wholesome mukbang creator, gentle-voiced, humble, enjoying a plate of local satay. He looks like a friendly neighbor you might meet in any village in central Java. You might even feel compelled to leave a positive comment. But pause for a second and read what the audience is actually saying. Why are viewers talking about graveyards instead of the food? Why are the comments filled with a chilling mix of disbelief and fear? And why do some users refer to this polite elderly man as the Nightmare of 2003? The context will shake you. The man sitting in front of that camera isn't just a food vlogger. His name is Sumanto, and 20 years ago, he didn't make headlines for eating satay on YouTube. He made history for breaking the ultimate human taboo in a small bamboo shack in Purbalingga. From a convict in one of the nation's most notorious cases to a digital content creator seeking likes and followers, how does this happen? Is the smile on the screen a sign of genuine rehabilitation? Or are we witnessing the strangest reinvention in the digital age? Today, we are not just reporting a crime. We are investigating the collapse and reconstruction of a human identity. Before we peel back the layers of this enigma, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to support our deep dives into the human psyche. Don't look away. The story of how a prisoner became an influencer begins right now. In the boundless digital landscape of the 21st century, the algorithms that govern our viewing habits often lead us down unexpected paths. It begins innocuously enough. A viewer, perhaps seeking a distraction during a lunch break or winding down after a long day, opens a video-sharing platform. The recommendation engine, driven by complex data points and engagement metrics, suggests a video that seems entirely ordinary. The thumbnail features an older man, his face weathered but wearing a gentle, somewhat shy expression. He sits before a modest spread of food, typically local Indonesian delicacies like satay or fried rice. The title is simple, inviting the audience to join him for a meal. To the uninitiated observer, this is just another entry in the popular genre of mukbang, where content creators film themselves eating while interacting with their audience. The video begins. The man on the screen speaks in a soft, polite tone. He wears a traditional cap, often associated with religious piety in the region, which adds to his grandfatherly demeanor. He greets his viewers with a standard, warm salutation, wishing them health and prosperity. As he begins to eat, his movements are deliberate and unhurried. He pauses to comment on the flavor of the peanut sauce or the tenderness of the meat, offering simple culinary critiques that resonate with local tastes. There is an air of humility about him, a sense that he is genuinely grateful for the meal before him. For a casual viewer stumbling upon this channel for the first time, the content is wholesome, perhaps even soothing. It represents the quiet side of the internet, far removed from the high-energy, overproduced spectacles that dominate the trending pages. However, a glance at the comments section immediately fractures this peaceful illusion. Below the video, a fierce and confusing debate rages, creating a jarring dissonance with the calm visuals above. While some users leave generic messages of support, praising the creator's appetite or suggesting new dishes to try, a significant portion of the audience is engaged in a much darker conversation. Comments written in capital letters express disbelief. Users ask if this is truly the same man. Others respond with irony, making cryptic references to special ingredients or forbidden meals. There are expressions of fear alongside declarations of forgiveness. To a stranger, this polarized reaction is baffling. Why would a video of an elderly man eating grilled chicken provoke such intense scrutiny and unease? The answer lies in a name that, for decades, has been synonymous with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the modern history of Indonesia. The man smiling at the camera is Sumanto. For those who lived through the early years of the new millennium, this name does not conjure images of a food vlogger. Instead, it evokes memories of a sensational news cycle that gripped the nation, dominated by headlines about grave desecration and unthinkable acts. The friendly face on the screen belongs to a figure who was once the center of a national moral panic, a man whose actions in the year 2003 challenged the boundaries of what society believed was possible. This transition from a figure of public fear to a digital content creator offers a fascinating, if unsettling, case study in the modern era of rehabilitation and celebrity. Sociologists and media analysts observe that the internet has a unique capacity to flatten history. On a digital platform, context is often stripped away. A video is judged by its immediate entertainment value rather than the biography of its creator. For the younger demographic, who may only know the name Sumanto as a meme or an urban legend passed down by their elders, the gravity of his past actions is diluted. He becomes a character, a brand, rather than a historical figure with a documented criminal record. This phenomenon raises difficult ethical questions about the nature of redemption in the public eye. Does the performance of normalcy on camera equate to genuine rehabilitation? Or is the audience merely participating in a macabre form of voyeurism, watching not because they enjoy the content, but because they cannot look away from the person creating it? Furthermore, the existence of this channel highlights a significant shift in how society processes trauma and taboo. In the past, individuals involved in such severe breaches of social norms would likely have lived out their days in total obscurity, shunned by their communities. Today, visibility is currency. The very notoriety that once made Sumanto a pariah now drives the algorithm to promote his videos. Every view, every comment, whether hateful, fearful, or supportive, signals to the platform that this content is relevant. It creates a feedback loop where the past is commodified. The comments section serves as a digital town square, where the collective memory of the public clashes with the current reality presented on the screen. Observers note that Sumanto's on-screen persona is meticulously curated. He discusses faith, gratitude, and the simple joys of daily life. This narrative of the reformed sinner is a powerful archetype in many cultures, and it resonates deeply in a society that values religious redemption. By presenting himself as a devout man who has left his dark past behind, he offers a path for the audience to accept him. It allows viewers to rationalize their consumption of his content. They are not supporting a criminal, they are witnessing a miracle of change. Yet, this narrative is constantly challenged by the digital footprint of history. A simple search query reveals the stark contrast between the content creator and the convict. The archival footage from 20 years ago shows a very different man, wild-eyed, erratic, and surrounded by police officers standing in sharp relief against the calm, smiling figure eating satay. This dichotomy is what makes the story of the Purbalingga case so enduring. It is not merely a story about a crime. It is a story about the human capacity for change and the public's capacity for memory. As the viewer watches him finish his meal and wave goodbye to the camera, the question remains unresolved. Is it possible for a person to truly shed such a heavy history? Or is the internet simply a mask that hides the scars of the past? To understand how a man could journey from a bamboo shack surrounded by police tape to a studio setup with a ring light and a smartphone, one must peel back the layers of time. One must leave the sanitized world of social media and return to the sweltering heat of a village in central Java, to a time before the internet was ubiquitous, when a quiet community was about to be shattered by a discovery that would haunt the nation for decades. The timeline of this harrowing sequence of events is anchored to a specific date, January 11th, 2003. In the broader historical context of Indonesia, this period was characterized by transition and modernization. Yet in the rural hamlet of Purbalingga in central Java, the rhythm of life remained deeply traditional and largely undisturbed by the rapid changes occurring in the capital. On this particular day, meteorological reports and local memory coincide to describe the weather as oppressive. It was an unusually hot day, even for a tropical climate. The heat was not merely a backdrop, but a defining feature of the atmosphere, heavy and lethargic, compelling the majority of the villagers to retreat into the shelter of their homes. The streets, usually bustling with the sounds of daily commerce and social interaction, were quiet as residents sought relief with electric fans or cold beverages, waiting for the temperature to drop. Amidst this stifling humidity, a somber announcement echoed through the village, breaking the midday stillness. A respected member of the community, a woman known to her neighbors as Madame Riena, had passed away. In Javanese village culture, the death of a neighbor is a significant communal event, triggering an immediate and collective response known as layayat, where the community gathers to offer condolences and assistance. Madame Riena was an elderly figure, well known in the area, and her passing was met with the customary respect and solemnity afforded to the senior members of society. The preparations for her interment began immediately, adhering to Islamic traditions which necessitate a prompt burial, typically on the same day as the passing. The funeral procession took place that afternoon. It was a dignified affair, attended by community members who walked with the family to the local cemetery to pay their final respects. The rituals were performed with care. The body was washed, shrouded, and prayers were recited, reinforcing the sanctity of the human vessel even after life has departed. By the time the burial was concluded, the sun had begun to dip lower, yet the heat persisted. As the mourners dispersed and returned to their homes, leaving the fresh mound of earth in the cemetery, there was a collective sense of closure. The community believed, as any society would, that the deceased had been laid to an eternal rest, protected by the soil and the sacred nature of the gravesite. However, on the periphery of this grieving community, both geographically and socially, lived Sumanto. He resided in a small, dilapidated hut located on the edge of the village, a physical manifestation of his isolation from the rest of the populace. By this point in time, Sumanto's life had unraveled significantly. Reports from the period indicate that his financial situation had deteriorated to a level of extreme destitution. He was living alone, estranged from family support systems that usually act as a safety net in rural Indonesia. The economic hardship was severe. Basic necessities such as rice were unaffordable, and protein sources like meat were entirely out of his reach. Observers and psychologists analyzing the case in retrospect suggest that this extreme deprivation created a dangerous intersection with his existing psychological vulnerabilities. When the village announcement broadcast the news of Madame Riena's death, it was intended as a call to mourn. Yet, for the man listening from the margins of society, the message was received through a distorted filter. The announcement did not trigger a sense of loss, but rather a darker, more utilitarian contemplation. It is at this juncture that the breakdown of social norms began. While the village viewed the grave as a sanctuary, Sumanto, driven by a complex mix of desperation and delusion, began to view it as a source of opportunity. The psychological landscape of the perpetrator during these hours is a subject of intense debate. Later investigations revealed that his motivations were not solely rooted in hunger, although that was a driving physical factor. There was also a metaphysical component, a warped interpretation of strength and vitality. He harbored a belief, influenced by previous interactions with pseudo-spiritual figures, that performing these forbidden rituals could confer supernatural powers or invulnerability. As the village settled into the quiet of the evening, seeking respite from the lingering heat, Sumanto waited. The passage of time during that night is critical to understanding the premeditation involved. He did not act in a frenzy of immediate impulse during the day when the cemetery was visible. Instead, he waited for the cover of darkness and the silence of the community. Approximately 16 hours after the burial had taken place, when the village was asleep and the risk of detection was minimal, the plan was set into motion. The juxtaposition here is stark and unsettling. A community sleeping peacefully, secure in their adherence to tradition and respect for the dead, while a single individual prepared to violate the most fundamental of human taboos. From a sociological perspective, this moment highlights the fragility of the social contract. A village relies on the unwritten rule that certain boundaries, like the sanctity of a grave, are inviolable. The residents of Purbalingga had no reason to suspect that the security of the cemetery would be breached. Grave robbery, while not unknown in history, is typically associated with the theft of valuable artifacts or goods buried with the deceased. The notion of stealing the remains themselves for consumption was so far outside the realm of normal human behavior that it likely never crossed the minds of the local security patrol or the grieving family. As the night deepened, the heat wave that had kept people indoors inadvertently aided the perpetrator. With fewer people venturing out to socialize or patrol, the path to the cemetery was clear. The environmental conditions, the social isolation of the suspect, and the recent tragedy of the death all converged to create a perfect storm. The stage was set for an act that would not only desecrate the memory of Madame Riena, but would also shatter the psychological sense of safety for the entire region. The silence of that night was deceptive. It was not a peace, but a pause before a discovery that would permanently alter the history of the village. The discovery that would irrevocably alter the identity of the village occurred the following morning, approximately 16 hours after the solemn interment of Madame Riena. In the quiet hours of early daylight, the cemetery, typically a place of undisturbed stillness, became the epicenter of a frantic and confused investigation. A local resident, passing by the grounds, was the first to observe an anomaly that defied explanation. The mound of earth, which had been carefully shaped and smoothed over the previous afternoon, was now chaotic and scattered. Upon closer inspection, the reality of the situation became undeniably clear. The grave had been excavated. The soil was piled haphazardly to the sides, and the burial pit stood open, revealing a terrifying vacancy where the deceased had been laid to rest. The news traveled through the hamlet with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered at the perimeter of the burial ground, their initial expressions of grief replaced by a profound and bewildered shock. In rural communities such as this, the desecration of a grave is an event that carries a heavy psychological weight, violating deep-seated cultural and religious taboos. The immediate assumption for many might have been theft of a different nature, grave robbery for grave goods or textiles. But the thoroughness of the excavation suggested a more disturbing objective. The coffin was not merely tampered with. The body itself was missing. This was not a crime of opportunity for material wealth, but an act that pointed towards a far more aberrant motivation. As the initial paralysis of shock began to subside, the community's collective instinct for justice and answers took over. The villagers, acting as an informal search party before law enforcement could fully mobilize, began to scour the immediate area for clues. It was not difficult to find a direction. The perpetrator, in what criminal analysts would later describe as a sign of disorganized behavior, had left a distinct and careless trail. A path of disturbed soil and dropped debris led away from the open grave, marking a clear route through the undergrowth and back towards the populated areas. This physical evidence suggested a lack of fear, or perhaps a complete detachment from the consequences of the action, reinforcing the theory that the suspect was operating under a delusion that rendered him oblivious to the risk of detection. The trail of earth was a grim breadcrumb trail that the villagers followed with a growing sense of dread. It did not lead towards the main road or out of the village, which would have indicated an outsider or a fleeing criminal. Instead, it wound its way towards the edge of the settlement, terminating at a location that was already a source of local unease. The dilapidated bamboo hut inhabited by Sumanto. The structure, simple and worn, stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the crime that the trail implicated. It was a residence that the community had long associated with eccentricity and isolation, but few had ever imagined it would become the focal point of a criminal investigation of this magnitude. When the group arrived at the dwelling, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Witnesses from the scene later recounted a moment of hesitation before the villagers approached the entrance. The trail of soil effectively ended at his doorstep, creating an undeniable link between the desecrated cemetery and the interior of the shack. According to reports from the time, one villager, emboldened by the presence of the group, stepped forward to peer through the gaps in the bamboo walls or the open doorway. What they observed inside confirmed their worst fears, though the reality was far more macabre than simple grave robbery. Inside the small, dimly lit shack, the disturbing reality of the crime was displayed without any attempt at concealment. Observers noted the presence of disturbing forensic evidence scattered across the floor. On a table, amidst the squalor of the hut, sat a plate of rice, accompanied by the grim evidence of his crime. The sight was so incongruous with normal human behavior that it took a moment for the witnesses to process what they were seeing. There was no treasure, no stolen jewelry, only the grim remnants of the deceased. The realization rippled through the crowd. The body of Madame Riena had not been stolen for profit, but for a much darker purpose. From an analytical perspective, this moment of discovery highlights the critical role of the community in rural policing and evidence preservation. In many remote areas, the community itself acts as the first line of response. Their ability to track the suspect so quickly prevented the destruction of evidence and allowed for a swift, albeit chaotic, resolution to the immediate mystery of the missing body. However, it also exposed the villagers to a trauma that is difficult to quantify. To see a neighbor, someone they had known since childhood, someone they called Suman, living in such a state and committing such an act, forced a confrontation with the absolute limits of human desperation and mental collapse. The scene at the hut also provided immediate insight into the suspect's psychological state. A rational criminal, aware of the moral and legal implications of their actions, would likely have attempted to hide the remains or dispose of the evidence. Sumanto had done neither. The casual placement of the remains alongside his daily meal suggested that, in his mind, the act had been normalized. He had integrated the unthinkable into his domestic routine. This lack of concealment is often a hallmark of psychosis, where the perpetrator's internal reality has completely supplanted societal norms. He did not hide the body because, in his distorted worldview, he perhaps believed he had done nothing that required hiding, or that his spiritual justifications rendered him above the law. As the crowd stood outside the hut, the transition from confusion to realization was complete. The whispers of cannibalism began to circulate, a word that felt foreign and cinematic, yet was the only descriptor that fit the evidence before them. They were no longer just looking for a missing corpse. They were standing on the precipice of a nightmare that would come to define their village for years to come. The investigation had technically just begun, but the verdict of the community was immediate and absolute. The disturbed earth at the cemetery was merely the opening chapter. The true horror lay within the bamboo walls of Sumanto's home. The police were summoned, but the image of that room, the bones, the rice, the mundane setting of a horrific meal, was already etched into the collective memory of Purbalingga, a scar that no amount of judicial process could easily heal. The arrival of law enforcement at the bamboo hut marked the transition from a village crisis to a formal criminal investigation. While the local residents had already formed a perimeter around the dwelling, driven by a mixture of curiosity and horror, the police officers who descended upon the scene were tasked with restoring order to a situation that teetered on the brink of chaos. The trail of disturbed soil had led them directly to this location, creating a tangible line of evidence connecting the desecrated grave to the residence of Sumanto. When the authorities stepped through the threshold of the dilapidated structure, they were met with a scene that defied standard procedural expectations. In typical criminal cases involving theft or violence, the perpetrator usually makes a concerted effort to conceal the evidence of their wrongdoing. However, inside this humble shack, the evidence was displayed with a disturbing lack of artifice. Upon entering the living space, investigators and witnesses observed a tableau that was both domestic and gruesome. Scattered across the floor were physical remnants of the grave desecration. These were not hidden under floorboards or buried in the yard, but lay in plain sight, integrated into the suspect's living environment. Perhaps most unsettling for the first responders was the sight on the table. There, amidst the clutter of a life lived in poverty, sat a plate of white rice accompanied by the evidence that shocked the officers. The juxtaposition of a mundane meal with the stark reality of the grave desecration created a cognitive dissonance for everyone present. It suggested that for the occupant of the house, the boundaries between the taboo and the ordinary had completely dissolved. Sumanto, the man at the center of this unfolding storm, did not resist. Accounts of the arrest describe a man who appeared strangely detached from the gravity of the situation. As police officers moved to secure him, placing handcuffs on his wrists, he did not fight, flee, or scream. Instead, he maintained a demeanor that some described as calm, even smiling. This reaction, or lack thereof, provided immediate insight for criminal psychologists analyzing the case. A rational offender, aware of the moral and legal consequences of their actions, typically exhibits signs of guilt, panic, or aggression when cornered. Sumanto's passive compliance suggested that he was operating under a different set of internal rules, where his actions were justified or perhaps even necessary, rather than criminal. The scene outside the hut was equally charged. As Sumanto was led away in restraints, the crowd of villagers that had gathered stood in a stunned silence. The sheer shock of the discovery had temporarily quelled the collective anger that would typically accompany such a violation of community trust. The murmurs that rippled through the assembly were filled with disbelief. The question that hung heavy in the humid air, unspoken yet shared by all, was whether the rumors were true. Had he actually consumed the remains of their neighbor? The presence of the meat on the table alongside the rice offered a grim and silent answer. But the mind struggled to accept it. The reality of the situation was so far removed from the norms of daily life in the village that the onlookers were left in a state of paralysis. Law enforcement officials recognized the volatility of the environment. While the crowd was currently stunned, the potential for mob justice is always high in close-knit rural communities when a sacred taboo is broken. Some villagers had reportedly armed themselves with weapons upon hearing the news, prepared to confront a monster. To ensure the safety of the suspect and the integrity of the judicial process, the police moved quickly to transport Sumanto away from the scene. The journey to the police station was not just an arrest, it was an extraction. This swift action prevented the situation from escalating into vigilante violence, allowing the legal system to take over the burden of judgment and punishment. From a criminological perspective, the arrest phase of the Sumanto case serves as a textbook example of a disorganized offender. In forensic psychology, offenders are often categorized by the level of planning and logic evident in their crimes. A disorganized offender typically has lower social competence, acts impulsively, and leaves significant physical evidence at the scene. Sumanto's actions fit this profile perfectly. The trail of soil leading from the grave to his door, the open display of remains, and the lack of an escape plan all pointed to a mind that was not calculating a perfect crime, but rather responding to internal delusions and desperate needs. This profile would become crucial later in the legal proceedings, as defense attorneys and psychiatrists argued over his mental competency and the intent behind his actions. The collection of evidence continued after Sumanto was removed. Police secured the hut, treating it as a primary crime scene. They documented the scattered bones and the remnants of the meal, preserving them for forensic analysis. These items would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Physical proof that could not be denied. However, for the people of the village, the evidence was more than just exhibits in a future trial. It was a violation of their peace. The bamboo hut, once just a sign of poverty on the edge of town, had been transformed into a symbol of horror. As the police tape went up and the investigators began their meticulous work, The village of Purbalingga was left to grapple with the knowledge that the person responsible for this nightmare was not a stranger or a ghost, but a neighbor they had known for years. The arrest was over, but the psychological impact on the community was only just beginning. The transition from the chaotic scene at the bamboo hut to the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the police interrogation room marked a pivotal shift in the case, transforming a village scandal into a matter of national judicial record. Once Sumanto was securely in custody, the immediate threat of public disorder subsided, allowing investigators to begin the arduous process of understanding the why behind an act that had left the community in a state of collective trauma. The interrogation that followed is now regarded by criminologists and legal historians as one of the most perplexing interactions in Indonesian law enforcement history. It was here, within the safety of the station, that the suspect began to unravel a narrative that straddled the uncomfortable line between severe mental delusion and extreme socioeconomic desperation. When detectives began their questioning, they likely anticipated resistance or denial, the standard responses of a criminal suspect facing serious charges. However, reports from the investigation indicate that Sumanto's demeanor was disarmingly cooperative. He did not attempt to obfuscate the truth or plead innocence in the traditional sense. Instead, with a facial expression that witnesses described as a calm smile, he admitted to the actions he was accused of. This admission was not delivered with the trembling voice of a man regretful of a crime, but with the factual tone of someone recounting a daily routine. This immediate confession provided the police with the legal grounds they needed, but it also opened a psychological Pandora's box. The clarity with which he spoke about the desecration stood in stark contrast to the irrationality of the act itself, creating a paradox that investigators struggled to navigate. In an effort to comprehend the reality of the event, officers asked a question that is rarely uttered in a police procedural. They asked him to describe the experience of consuming human flesh. The answer Sumanto provided has since become a macabre footnote in the case's lore. He did not describe the act in terms of ritualistic ecstasy or horror. Instead, he offered a detached culinary critique. He reportedly smiled and informed the officers about his experience with a detached demeanor, making chilling comparisons that revealed his lack of remorse. This clinical comparison of the deceased to various animals stripped the victim of humanity in the eyes of the perpetrator, revealing a profound level of desensitization. For the investigators, this response was a clear indicator that they were not dealing with a standard criminal mind, but rather an individual whose perception of reality had been fundamentally altered. The central focus of the interrogation then shifted to the motive. Why would a man violate the sanctity of a grave to consume his neighbor? Initially, Sumanto provided a justification that was deeply rooted in local superstition and mystical belief. He claimed that his actions were driven by a desire to obtain spiritual power. In his distorted worldview, the consumption of human remains was a pathway to invincibility, a method to become physically stronger and perhaps even immortal. This explanation resonated with certain fringe beliefs regarding black magic and shamanism that still lingered in the cultural periphery of the region. He explained that this was not a random act of depravity, but a calculated effort to achieve a supernatural status, a goal that he believed required him to suppress his natural human revulsion. However, as the investigation deepened and psychologists began to weigh in, a second, more grounded motive began to emerge, complicating the narrative of the mystic cannibal. While the spiritual justification was the one Sumanto presented to the authorities to explain the purpose of the act, he later revealed a far simpler and more tragic catalyst: hunger. In later admissions, including conversations held years afterwards, he acknowledged that his extreme poverty had played a decisive role. He stated that he had seen others eating meat, but could not afford to purchase it himself. In his desperate state, the distinction between the living and the dead, and between animal and human, had blurred. The grave became, in his eyes, a source of sustenance that had been abandoned by the living. This dual motivation, part mystical delusion, part survival instinct, presented a complex challenge for the legal system. If he truly believed he was performing a ritual for power, it suggested a break from reality that might warrant a diagnosis of psychosis or schizophrenia. Conversely, if he acted out of hunger, it highlighted a severe failure of the social safety net in the village. The police eventually turned their attention to the origins of his spiritual beliefs, suspecting that he had not developed these ideas in a vacuum. This line of questioning would eventually lead them to investigate his past associations, specifically looking for a mentor or teacher who might have planted these dangerous ideas in his mind. From a sociological perspective, the interrogation of Sumanto serves as a dark mirror to the struggles of rural society. It exposes how traditional beliefs can curdle into dangerous delusions when mixed with isolation and poverty. The police were left with a confession that was technically complete but psychologically baffling. They had the who, the what, and the how, but the why remained a tangled mess of superstition and starvation. The calm smile of the suspect in the face of such grotesque accusations lingered with the officers long after the session ended, a haunting reminder that the distance between civilization and savagery is sometimes measured only by the depth of one's delusion or the emptiness of one's stomach. The case was no longer just about a missing body. It was an inquiry into the collapse of a human mind. To understand the trajectory of the man who would eventually terrify a nation, one must look back to a time long before the headlines, to a beginning that offered no hint of the darkness to come. Sumanto was born on March 3, 1972, in the quiet regency of Purbalingga, Central Java. He was the eldest of 5 siblings, entering the world with the expectations and responsibilities often placed upon the firstborn in Javanese culture. Contrary to the image of destitute isolation that defined his later years, his early childhood was marked by relative comfort and stability. His family was considered well off compared to their neighbors, possessing inherited land and property that provided a buffer against the economic uncertainties of village life. They lived in a residence that was larger than most in the area, and as a young boy, Sumanto enjoyed privileges that his peers did not, such as new clothes and toys, markers of status that set him apart in a community where resources were often scarce. During his formative years at Pelamutan Elementary School, he was known affectionately among his classmates as Suman. Even in these early days, however, there were subtle indications that he marched to the beat of a different drum. Neighbors and peers recall him as being slightly eccentric, known for pulling pranks and exhibiting behavior that, while not dangerous, was perceived as odd. Despite these quirks, he was a capable student who maintained decent grades, showing no obvious signs of the severe psychological deterioration that would plague his adulthood. His ambition was evident when he sought to continue his education at a specific middle school. Although he failed the entrance examination on his first attempt, his determination drove him to repeat the 6th grade solely to retake the test. On his second attempt, he succeeded, demonstrating a resilience and focus that suggested a promising future lay ahead. The daily routine of his adolescence was arduous but disciplined. He would walk 3 kilometers to his new school each day, a journey made on foot that spoke to the physical demands of rural life. After his academic duties were fulfilled, he contributed to the family economy by herding goats and collecting weeds to feed them, balancing his studies with the agricultural labor expected of young men in his village. In the evenings, he sought spiritual grounding, studying religious texts at the local mosque. Life in the village was simple, devoid of modern distractions like television. Entertainment was communal, found in traveling outdoor cinemas or traditional puppet shows that brought the community together. It was a structured, predictable existence, grounded in faith, family, and tradition. However, the stability that underpinned Sumanto's world was fragile, and during his middle school years, it shattered completely. The family's financial foundation crumbled with devastating speed. The decline was precipitous. First, the luxuries of new clothing vanished, followed soon after by the struggle to secure basic necessities like food. To survive, the family was forced to liquidate their assets, selling off their livestock, their land, and eventually, even their furniture. The large house that had been a symbol of their status was abandoned for a much smaller, modest dwelling, a physical manifestation of their fall from grace. This sudden descent into poverty is cited by observers as a critical inflection point in Sumanto's psychological development. In the third year of his middle school education, amidst this economic turmoil, Sumanto abruptly dropped out. While the precise reasons were never formally documented, the consensus among those who knew him is that the crushing weight of financial pressure made continuing his education impossible. This withdrawal from the school system marked the beginning of his social isolation. Without the structure of the classroom or the future prospects that education provided, he was left adrift in a reality defined by scarcity and loss. Compounding this external hardship was a home environment that, according to reports, lacked the emotional nurturing necessary to buffer a child against such trauma. Like many families in rural Indonesia at the time, his parents adhered strictly to traditional beliefs. Within this cultural framework, signs of mental distress or behavioral acting out were often misinterpreted. Rather than recognizing these changes as symptoms of psychological struggle or a reaction to trauma, they were frequently dismissed as mere naughtiness or character flaws. Consequently, Sumanto grew into adulthood in an environment where resources were non-existent. Emotional support was absent, and his developing mental health needs were continuously ignored. Experts in psychology and sociology analyzing the case emphasize that this combination of factors, childhood abundance followed by sudden deprivation, social isolation, and the neglect of emotional well-being creates a fertile ground for mental instability. Studies suggest that individuals who experience such profound shifts in security and status during their developmental years are at a higher risk of struggling with mental health issues as adults. For some, this manifests as aggression. For others, like Sumanto, it initiates a spiral into deviant behavior. By the time he reached the threshold of adulthood, the promising young student who had walked kilometers to learn was gone, replaced by a man who had drifted far from the normative path, isolated and struggling in a world that had ceased to care for him. The roots of the tragedy were firmly planted not in mysticism, but in the harsh, unforgiving soil of socio-economic collapse and neglect. By the time Sumanto reached adulthood, the trajectory of his life had shifted away from the structured potential of his youth toward a path defined by transience and instability. Leaving behind the economic ruin of his family home in central Java, he sought new opportunities in Lampung, a province on the southern tip of Sumatra known for its agricultural industries. This migration was a common narrative for young men of his generation. A journey undertaken in the hope that geographical distance could provide a reset button for financial and personal fortunes. For a brief period, it appeared that this change of scenery might offer the stability he so desperately lacked. He secured employment and, in the course of his new life, formed a romantic attachment to a woman named Sutria. The relationship progressed to marriage, marking a moment where reintegration into a normative social structure seemed not only possible, but imminent. However, the domestic tranquility was short-lived. According to accounts from those who knew the couple, the union began to fracture almost immediately after the wedding formalities were concluded. A distinct behavioral shift was observed in Sumanto, characterized by a volatile temperament that had not been previously apparent during the courtship phase. The gentle eccentricity of his childhood hardened into a quickness to anger and a propensity for hostility. The specific details of the domestic discord remain preserved in the oral histories of his acquaintances rather than official police records. But the outcome was definitive. The environment within the home became untenable due to this emerging pattern of aggression, leading to a swift dissolution of the marriage. The divorce was not merely a legal separation, but a reinforcement of his inability to maintain the interpersonal bonds that typically anchor an individual to reality. Undeterred by this initial failure, Sumanto attempted to rebuild a family unit once more. In the year 1993, he entered into a second marriage, this time with a widow named Tugen, whom he had met while working at a sugarcane factory. This union appeared, on the surface, to be more grounded in shared labor and mutual support. Together, they welcomed a daughter, Titi Swahu, establishing a nuclear family that should have provided a powerful incentive for stability. Yet, even the responsibilities of fatherhood and the partnership of a new wife were insufficient to counteract the internal drift that was pulling him away from conventional society. It was during this period that a disturbing cycle of disappearances began to manifest, a pattern that would become the hallmark of his adult life. Sumanto would frequently vanish from the family home for extended periods, offering no explanation to his wife regarding his destination or his expected return. These absences were not motivated by employment opportunities or extramarital affairs in the traditional sense, but by a growing obsession with esoteric knowledge. It is believed that during these unannounced departures, he was seeking out spiritual teachers and engaging in practices that existed on the fringes of cultural acceptability. He became a transient figure, moving between the world of his family and a shadowy realm of mysticism. When he did return to the domestic sphere, his presence was often described as disruptive and fearful. The cycle of abandonment, followed by volatile reunions, eroded the foundation of the marriage. Tugan, unable to sustain a partnership with a man who was physically absent and emotionally volatile, eventually separated from him. Sociologists analyzing this period of his life point to these failed relationships as critical milestones in his psychological deterioration. The breakdown of 2 marriages and the estrangement from his child stripped away the social checks and balances that usually regulate human behavior. Without a spouse to ground him or a family to provide a daily routine, Sumanto was left entirely to his own devices. The loss of these connections likely accelerated his descent into the delusional belief systems that would later motivate his crimes. Isolation is often a catalyst for radicalization, whether political or, in this case, spiritual. When an individual is cut off from the feedback loop of normal social interaction, their internal narratives, no matter how distorted, can grow unchecked. By the early years of the new millennium, the man who had once been a husband, a father, and a factory worker had been reduced to a solitary existence. He returned to his hometown of Purbalingga, not as the successful migrant who had made his fortune, but as a destitute and broken figure. He took up residence in the small bamboo hut on the edge of the village, living in a state of profound alienation. The community viewed him with a mixture of pity and wariness, aware of his strange history, but unaware of the depth of his unraveling. He had become a man without a tether, floating in a vacuum of poverty and isolation. It was in this vacuum that the dangerous ideas implanted by his mentors would eventually take root, growing in the dark until they consumed him completely. The failure of his relationships was not just a personal tragedy. It was the removal of the final barrier, standing between Sumanto and the unthinkable act that lay ahead. As investigators peeled back the layers of Sumanto's fractured psyche, they discovered that the roots of his actions extended far beyond the borders of Purbalingga. The initial confession, in which he claimed a desire for invincibility, prompted law enforcement to look for the origin of such a specific and dangerous belief system. This inquiry led them back in time and across the sea to the province of Lampung, to the period of his early adulthood when he was still a married man attempting to build a life away from his family home. It was here, in the shadows of his failing personal life, that he encountered a figure who would become the architect of his delusion. The police identified this individual as Taslim, a man who presented himself not as a criminal, but as a mentor and a guide. Taslim was not a medical doctor, nor was he a recognized religious scholar in the traditional sense. In the local parlance, he was known as a dukun, a term often translated as a shaman or a practitioner of traditional spiritual healing. In many parts of rural Indonesia, such figures hold significant sway, often stepping in where conventional medicine or social services are absent. However, authorities soon realized that the guidance Taslim offered was neither medicinal nor benevolent. According to Sumanto's testimony provided during the investigation, It was this mentor who first introduced the morbid concept that would eventually lead to the tragedy in Purbalingga. The instruction allegedly given by Taslim was specific and chilling in its calculation. He persuaded Sumanto that the path to acquiring supernatural abilities, specifically the power to act as a master over life and death, lay in violating the sanctity of the deceased. The mentor reportedly told him that if he could successfully complete the ritual with 7 specific targets, he would gain the extraordinary power to bring the dead back to life. This promise of resurrection and invulnerability was a potent lure for a man like Sumanto, who was already suffering from a sense of powerlessness and social irrelevance. The directive did not stop at 7. The mentor allegedly elaborated that for even greater power, one might need to consume 21 or even 41 bodies. Confronted with these staggered goals, Sumanto decided to set his sights on the initial target of 7. The dynamic between Taslim and Sumanto offers a disturbing case study in psychological manipulation and the dangers of unregulated spiritual authority. Sociologists observing the case have noted that individuals in states of extreme vulnerability, whether due to poverty, isolation, or mental instability, are uniquely susceptible to the influence of charismatic figures who promise a quick reversal of fortune. For Sumanto, the teachings of Taslim provided a framework that made sense of his suffering. It offered him a secret knowledge, a way to transcend his miserable reality and become a figure of immense power. The act of grave desecration, therefore, was reframed in his mind not as a crime against the community, but as a necessary trial on the path to spiritual enlightenment. This relationship highlights a critical issue regarding the intersection of cultural beliefs and mental health. In a society where belief in the supernatural is woven into the fabric of daily life, the line between traditional practice and dangerous delusion can sometimes blur. When a trusted figure like a dukun validates a distorted thought process, it can entrench a psychosis that might otherwise have been treatable. Taslim's role was effectively that of an enabler, validating Sumanto's darkest impulses and giving them a structured purpose. The mentor provided the mythology, and the student, driven by desperation and a deteriorating grip on reality, provided the action. Despite the gravity of these accusations and Sumanto's insistence that he was merely following instructions, the legal pursuit of the mentor proved difficult. While the investigation acknowledged Sumanto's claims about Taslim's influence, there is no substantial public record of a thorough prosecution or conviction of the shaman himself. This absence of legal resolution for the teacher left a lingering sense of unease. It suggested that while the physical perpetrator had been caught, the ideological source of the crime remained largely untouched. The narrative of the mentor and the myth serves as a cautionary tale about the power of influence. It demonstrates how a single dangerous idea, planted in a vulnerable mind, can grow into a tragedy that devastates an entire community, turning a desperate man into a notorious criminal, while the architect of the nightmare remains a ghost in the machine of justice. The investigation into the events at the bamboo hut in Purbalingga initially focused on a single, definitive act of grave desecration. Yet as law enforcement delved deeper into the physical evidence gathered from the scene, the scope of the inquiry began to expand in disturbing directions. The authorities were soon confronted with forensic realities that suggested the incident involving Madame Riena was not an isolated deviation, but potentially part of a broader and more prolonged pattern of behavior. Inside the cramped confines of the suspect's residence, amidst the clutter of daily life, investigators discovered additional biological materials that did not match the profile of the woman whose grave had been disturbed. These findings introduced a chilling variable to the case: the possibility that there were other victims whose fates had gone unnoticed or unreported by the community. Forensic analysts working on the case faced a complex puzzle. While the remains of the recently deceased woman were identifiable due to the proximity of the burial and the freshness of the evidence, other bone fragments recovered from the site presented a significant challenge. Early reports indicated that some of these additional remains were determined to be female, yet they could not be conclusively linked to any known missing persons reports or specific grave robberies in the immediate vicinity. This ambiguity aligned with the suspect's earlier admissions regarding the instructions he had allegedly received from his spiritual mentor. If the objective had indeed been to consume a specific quota of individuals to achieve supernatural power, the presence of unidentified remains raised the harrowing question of how close he had come to fulfilling that grim tally before his arrest. The suspicion that Sumanto's activities extended beyond scavenging the dead to potentially harming the living crystallized around the disappearance of a man named Mistam. Mistam was a familiar figure in the village, known to the residents as an elderly provider of traditional massage and healing therapies. His profession required him to visit various homes, making him a mobile and well-known presence in the community. Witness statements collected by the police established a timeline that placed Mistam near the suspect's residence prior to his disappearance. According to these accounts, the last confirmed sighting of the masseur involved him heading towards Sumanto's hut. After that evening, Mistam was never seen again, vanishing without a trace and leaving his family and neighbors in a state of suspended grief. When police searched Sumanto's dwelling, they did not find Mistam's body, but they did discover items of clothing that were identified as belonging to the missing man. The discovery of these personal effects within the suspect's home provided powerful circumstantial evidence. In the court of public opinion, this was viewed as undeniable proof of guilt. The community largely believed that the masseur had fallen victim to the same delusions that had desecrated Madame Rihanna's grave. However, the gap between public perception and legal proof is often wide and difficult to bridge. Without a body, a confession to murder, or forensic evidence proving that a homicide had occurred on the premises, the authorities found themselves in a legal bind. The clothing proved that Mistam had likely been there, but it did not prove he had been killed there. This nuance highlights the immense difficulty of prosecuting crimes in the absence of a corpus delicti, or the body of the crime. The legal system requires concrete evidence to substantiate a charge of murder. In the case of Mistam, the absence of physical remains meant that the prosecution could not definitively establish the cause of death or even confirm that death had occurred at the hands of another. Consequently, despite the strong suspicions of the police and the certainty of the villagers, Sumanto was never formally charged with the murder of Mistam. The disappearance remained a cold, unresolved thread in the broader tapestry of the case, leaving a lingering sense of injustice for the family of the missing man. The complexity of the investigation was further compounded by the suspect's own inconsistent narratives regarding his history. During the formal police interrogation and the subsequent trial, Sumanto maintained a specific version of events. He admitted to the theft of the body from the grave but steadfastly denied killing anyone. His defense relied on the distinction that he was a scavenger of the dead, not a predator of the living. However, in later years, during informal interviews with the media and conversations that took place after his release, his story reportedly shifted. There were instances where he alluded to having taken the lives of two individuals, a fellow worker and a robber who had attempted to target him. He claimed to have kept specific body parts as charms for protection, blurring the line between his spiritual delusions and actual violent acts. These later admissions, while sensational, possessed no legal weight. They were the ramblings of a man with a documented history of mental instability, and without forensic corroboration, they could not be used to reopen closed cases. Legal analysts and psychologists have debated whether these claims were confessions of genuine crimes or merely the fabrications of a mind that struggled to distinguish between fantasy and reality. It is possible that in his distorted memory, the line between what he did and what he imagined doing had vanished. For the public, however, these inconsistencies only deepened the enigma. They suggested that the full extent of the tragedy might never be known, and that the legal resolution, which focused solely on the theft of remains, was an incomplete accounting of the true horror that had transpired. The investigation into the missing pieces of the Sumanto case serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of forensic science and the judicial process in the early 2003 period. It underscores the frustration of investigators who, despite having a suspect and circumstantial evidence, were unable to build a homicide case that would stand up in court. The unidentified bones and the missing masseur represent the silent victims of the saga, individuals whose stories were overshadowed by the sensational nature of the grave robbery. As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution was forced to narrow its focus, leaving the darker, unproven allegations to drift into the realm of rumor and legend, unresolved and hauntingly ambiguous. When the case finally reached the courts in the middle of 2003, it became a focal point for the entire nation, dominating the media landscape in a way few criminal proceedings ever had. The courtroom was not merely a place of legal arbitration. It transformed into a theater where the boundaries of law, morality, and mental health were publicly debated. The prosecution faced a unique and frustrating challenge from the outset. While the public and the press labeled Sumanto a monster, the legal system required specific, provable charges. Because there was no forensic evidence to link him to a homicide, no body for the missing masseur, and no witness to a murder, the state could not charge him with killing anyone. Instead, the indictment was reduced to charges that felt woefully inadequate to the public: theft of property and the desecration of a grave. The defense strategy hinged on the psychological state of the accused. Legal experts and psychiatrists were brought in to testify, sparking a fierce debate about his culpability. The defense presented a diagnosis from the police psychiatric department, dated January 22nd, which confirmed that the defendant suffered from a significant mental health condition. They argued that his actions were not driven by criminal malice or a desire to harm, but by a warped understanding of reality, influenced by severe mental instability and traditional delusions. The argument was that he could not be held fully responsible for his actions because he genuinely believed he was fulfilling a spiritual duty rather than committing a crime. However, the prosecution maintained that despite his eccentric beliefs, he was aware of his actions. They argued that he waited until nightfall to act, suggesting a level of lucidity and an understanding that his behavior was socially unacceptable. The courtroom became a clash between modern legal standards and the complexities of rural mysticism. Sumanto himself added to the spectacle, reportedly insisting on his innocence regarding murder while calmly admitting to the act of taking the body. He did not view the grave as a sacred space, but as a resource he had utilized. For the observers in the gallery and those watching on television, the trial highlighted a disturbing gap in the penal code. The law was prepared to punish thieves and killers, but it struggled to categorize a man who was a scavenger of the dead. On July 22, 2003, the judge delivered the final verdict, a decision that would resonate with controversy long after the gavel fell. Sumanto was found guilty, but the sentence handed down was only 5 years in prison. This was 1 year less than what the prosecution had requested, and significantly less than what the public felt was appropriate for the severity of the transgression. The leniency of the sentence was rooted in the technicalities of the law. Since the court could not prove he had taken a life, they could only punish him for disturbing the soil and stealing what was legally defined as property, the remains of Madame Reina. This classification of a human body as property stirred a profound unease within the community. Even the defense lawyer raised moral concerns about this legal definition, arguing that a deceased person deserved more respect than to be treated as a stolen object. The verdict felt like a mismatch between the crime and the punishment. The court acknowledged that the victim in the grave was likely not the only one involved, citing the other remains found in his home. Yet no additional charges were formally filed due to the lack of identification. This left many with a sense of unresolved justice, particularly those who suspected his involvement in the disappearance of other villagers. The aftermath of the sentencing revealed the limitations of the judicial system in handling cases of extreme deviation. To the villagers of Purbalingga, a 5-year sentence implied that the nightmare was temporary. They were forced to grapple with the reality that the man who had terrified their community would eventually return. The decision was a strict application of the law, but it failed to address the emotional and psychological wounds of the society he had offended. It was a legal victory in terms of securing a conviction, but a moral confusion for a country that saw his actions as a violation of the sacred, not just the breaking of a statute. Life inside the prison walls brought a stark reality check for the man who had once sought invincibility. Sumanto did not serve the full 5 years. His sentence was reduced, and he was released early after just 3 years due to good behavior and remissions, a standard practice in the Indonesian penal system. However, those 3 years were transformative. Stripped of his isolation and placed within the regimented environment of the correctional facility, the delusions that had sustained him began to fracture. The invincibility he had sought through his disturbing rituals was proven false by the mundane physical realities of incarceration. He felt pain. He felt cold. And most importantly, he felt the same human vulnerabilities as every other inmate. It was during this period of confinement that the true motivation for his actions was quietly confirmed. In a candid conversation with a prison officer who watched over him, Sumanto dropped the mystical facade. He admitted, in a moment of clarity, that hunger had been the primary driver. He rationalized his actions with a chilling logic born of extreme desperation and poverty, viewing the crime as a means of survival. This admission stripped away the aura of black magic that had surrounded him, revealing a pitiable figure driven by extreme poverty and mental confusion. By the time he was preparing for release in 2006, Sumanto was reportedly a changed man. The aggressive, volatile behavior that had destroyed his marriages and terrified his neighbors had subsided. He began to show signs of genuine remorse and a willingness to reintegrate into society. The prison system, often criticized, had in this instance managed to stabilize him. He was no longer the corpse eater of the headlines, but a man looking for a second chance. However, the world outside the prison gates had not forgotten, and his return to freedom would prove to be as complicated as his trial. Upon his release, Sumanto faced an immediate and harsh reality. He could not go home. The residents of his native village in Purbalingga were not ready to welcome him back. The fear and stigma attached to his name were too deep. He was effectively a man without a place in the world, rejected by the community that knew him best. Salvation came from an unexpected source. A religious leader named Supono Mustajab, who ran a specialized boarding school or pesantren called Anur, offered him sanctuary. This institution was known for taking in individuals with mental health issues and those whom society had discarded. At the pesantren, Sumanto began a rigorous process of rehabilitation rooted in faith and community. He was taught religious studies, encouraged to repent, and given daily tasks that provided structure to his life. The environment was one of acceptance rather than judgment. Observers and fellow students noticed a profound shift in his personality. The man who had once been feared for his erratic behavior became gentle and friendly. He was often seen smiling and formed close bonds with the other residents, reintegrating into a social group for the first time in decades. This period of his life challenged the public's perception. Stories of his rehabilitation began to spread, causing some to look at his case with a degree of sympathy. People began to wonder if he was truly a monster, or simply a victim of circumstance, a man who had been hungry, isolated, and mentally ill, and who was now finding peace through faith. The sanctuary, provided by Haji Supono, allowed Sumanto to rebuild his identity, not as a criminal, but as a student of religion, proving that even in the aftermath of the most severe taboos, human connection is the most effective cure. As the years passed, Sumanto did not fade into obscurity as many expected. Instead, he re-entered the public eye in a manner that was both unexpected and surreal. The rise of digital media and the changing landscape of Indonesian pop culture created a space for him to become a public figure. He began appearing at local events, including a controversial running competition playfully titled to reference his past, where he was the guest of honor. This marked the beginning of his transition from a figure of horror to a figure of curiosity, and eventually, entertainment. The most jarring evolution occurred when he established a presence on social media. Operating under an official account, he began sharing glimpses of his daily life, motivational quotes, and, most surprisingly, mukbang videos. The irony of a man with his specific history becoming a food content creator was lost on no one. In one viral clip, he was filmed eating satay, his favorite food, with evident enjoyment. The video circulated rapidly, garnering millions of views. The image of Sumanto, once feared for his dietary transgressions, now sitting before a camera and reminding viewers to be grateful for their meals, created a cognitive dissonance that fascinated the internet. This new career path polarized the audience. To some, it was an inspiring story of rehabilitation, a man who had served his time and was rebuilding his life through harmless entertainment. To others, it was deeply uncomfortable, a trivialization of a horrific crime. Critics questioned whether it was appropriate to watch and laugh along with a man who had caused such trauma. Yet, the views continued to climb. Sumanto had found a way to monetize his infamy, transforming the darkest chapter of his life into a digital brand. He was no longer just a former convict. He was a content creator, smiling for the camera while the comments section argued over his soul. Today, the story of the Purbalingga case occupies a strange space in the collective consciousness. Sumanto lives a life that is a hybrid of religious devotion and digital visibility. He is no longer the destitute man in the bamboo hut. He is a recognizable face, framed by food and followers, rather than police tape. However, the scars of the past have not fully healed. The skeptical comments that appear beneath his videos serve as a constant reminder that, for many, forgiveness has its limits. The tension between those who believe in his rehabilitation and those who cannot forget his crimes remains unresolved. The saga has also sparked a necessary conversation about mental health in rural Indonesia. It forced the public to look at how poverty and isolation can distort the human mind, and how traditional beliefs can sometimes mask serious psychological distress. The realization that Sumanto was likely suffering from a mental disorder, rather than just pure evil, has shifted the narrative from one of judgment to one of caution and awareness. Ultimately, the case leaves us with difficult questions. Can a person truly move on from such a violation of social norms? Is our consumption of his new content a form of support? Or is it merely a modern version of the sideshow, where we stare at the cannibal not because we care about his satay, but because we are fascinated by his history? Sumanto's smile on screen is genuine, but the shadow behind it is long. His story is a testament to the complexity of the human condition, capable of the darkest acts, driven by desperation, and yet also capable of change. As he finishes his meal and waves to the camera, the audience is left to decide for themselves. Are they watching a monster who learned to hide, or a man who finally learned to live? This brings us to the end of one of the most perplexing and disturbing cases in modern history. It is a story that challenges our understanding of hunger, mental health, and the capacity for redemption. What are your thoughts on Sumanto's transformation? Do you believe his rehabilitation is complete? Or does the digital fame mask a darker reality? As we navigate the strange corners of the internet, it is worth remembering that every face on a screen has a history, and sometimes that history is stranger than fiction. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. If you found this analysis compelling, please share your thoughts in the discussion below. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.